Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots like you to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Greg Van about what you need to know about hearing loss. And it's not just as simple as wearing a headset when you're in the cockpit, as there are many ways you can damage your hearing with everyday activities that you wouldn't think could damage hearing. Later, Mike Bush answers listener questions about engines. Last week in episode 186, we talked about aviation news of the weird with Flying Magazine's Rob Mark. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And I would like to ask for your help on one thing, which is to share this show with a friend. It's easy to do. Just look for the share button on whatever app that you're using. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, look for those three dots down at the bottom of the screen. Touch that, and it will bring up the share button. Then share it with a friend who you think might benefit from the show. Thanks so much for your help. This week in the news, FAA pays out $44 million in an age discrimination lawsuit. A plane in Nebraska takes off by itself before crashing, and separately, a Nebraska pilot is a hero for removing a gun from an aircraft that was about to be stolen. All this and more, and the news starts now. From WashingtonPost.com, FAA agrees to pay $44 million to resolve long-running age discrimination lawsuit. About 700 former agency employees, whose jobs were outsourced in 2005, will share in the settlement. The FAA has agreed to pay $44 million to resolve a long-standing lawsuit brought by former employees who allege that their jobs were outsourced because of their ages. The case was filed in 2005 when the FAA decided to hand over the work of about 2,000 employees, known as Flight Services Specialist, to a private company. FAA officials, including the head of the agency at the time, were open about the aging specialist workforce being a factor in the outsourcing deal, according to evidence presented in the lawsuit. But the case languished in the courts for years as one judge retired and the law firm that originally represented the employees was closed. With the former employees reaching retirement age, a new team of lawyers began hashing out a settlement with the government last year. The FAA did not admit wrongdoing and said in a statement that the settlement speaks for itself. The lawsuit initially sought to stop the privatization plan, which involved giving a $1.8 billion contract to Lockheed Martin, a government services firm and weapons maker. When that effort failed, the specialist and their support staff became Lockheed employees. Their pay remained roughly the same, but they lost out on lucrative air traffic control pensions. Joseph Sellers, a partner at law firm Cohen-Milstein, which joined the case in 2016, described the financial harm faced by the former employees as brutal. Suddenly, their pension investment was ripped away from them, he said. Recouping that retirement pay became the focus of the lawsuit. The $44 million settlement fund will be shared by 646 former employees or their estates. Sellers acknowledged the payouts won't cover everything the former employees lost, but he said the case was unusual because it was not pursued as a class action. That meant that even had they won, each of the 671 plaintiffs would have had to have a separate trial to determine what they were owed, potentially extending the case several more years. With the former employees aging, Sellers said it made sense to strike a deal. Quote, "You don't recover 100% when you're settling a case," Sellers said. "Our clients faced a tough decision." Because the case was not a class action, the other 1,300 or so former FAA employees who were affected by the outsourcing deal but were not part of the lawsuit won't get anything. The FAA's Flight Services Specialists provide weather information and flight planning help to private pilots, but are not involved in air traffic control. But in recent years, demand for the specialist work has declined dramatically, as much of the information they provided can be found online. By the time the FAA was pursuing the outsourcing deal, it had stopped replacing the specialist as they left. A 2016 review by the Department of Transportation's Inspector General concluded that the outsourcing effort had largely been a success, saving the FAA about $2 billion over 13 years. From the FAA.gov, FAA adds more space launch activity areas to pilot navigation charts. The FAA is increasing pilot safety and airspace awareness by marking more space launch activity areas on navigation charts. Adding space launch activity areas to the navigation charts used by pilots who fly visually responds to the recent and expected continued growth of commercial space operations. All 12 FAA-licensed spaceports and other federal and private launch and reentry sites are represented on the charts by a rocket symbol. These areas are in Alaska, California, Colorado, Florida, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and Virginia. Pilots can download the free charts and reference the FAA Aeronautical Chart User's Guide for more information. In addition, the FAA encourages pilots to check the NOTAM database for TFRs issued to divert air traffic from where space operations are scheduled. In 2020, the FAA licensed 41 commercial space launches and re-entries, the most in the agency's history. For 2021, that number could reach 50 or more. Pilots also need to be aware of NASA, military, and other government launches that FAA does not license. From avweb.com, this is pretty amazing, a $1,000 landing fee proposed for all of Massachusetts' private aircraft. The Massachusetts senator representing Cape Cod will undoubtedly hear from his well-heeled constituents over his proposed bill to charge a $1,000 fee for every landing of private, corporate, and charter aircraft in the state. Julian Sayer has filed a petition in the state Senate to have the body adopt, quote, an act to mitigate the climate impact of private and corporate air travel. And while the bill might get an especially prickly reception in the area he represents, which is Cape Cod, it would similarly apply to virtually every aircraft that doesn't fly for hire that uses a publicly operated runway anywhere in the state of Massachusetts. It actually specifically exempts public aircraft, scheduled commercial passenger air transportation, freight, and cargo aircraft. If adopted, the new law would order every airport commission governing a municipal or county-owned airport or the board of directors of the Massachusetts Port Authority that they should assess a climate impact landing fee of not less than $1,000 on personal aircraft, corporate-owned aircraft, and charter rental aircraft each time any such aircraft is to land at an airport in the Commonwealth. The airports in the state would split the money. The petition was filed in February but came to light last week. From kitplanes.com, the hiring spree continues, this time with Zenith. Recently, both Vans Aircraft and Sonics have reached out to the homebuilder community in search of qualified employees, and that's something on Zenith's radar as well. According to Zenith President Sebastian Heinz, like most in the industry, our sales are very strong currently, and we need to increase production to keep up with existing and new orders. We're currently seeking help in both our shipping and fabrication departments, as well as in our office. Zenith is based in Mexico, Missouri, where it offers an excellent work environment with small-town Midwestern hospitality. And here's more from the company's website. They say for more than a quarter century, Zenith Aircraft Company has been manufacturing easy-to-build and fun-to-fly aircraft kits. Zenith is the #1 brand of light sport aircraft in the U.S. based on FAA registrations. Zenith produces kit aircraft with superb short takeoff and landing capabilities, demonstrated by the Stoll CH-701 and Stoll CH-750 models, as well as economical two-seat cross-country cruisers, the high-wing Zenith CH-750 Cruiser and the sleek low-wing Zenith CH-650. With builder choices in mind, all Zenith aircraft kits are designed to offer builders a wide variety of suitable engines, avionics, and custom kit options. Zenith builders typically build their own airplanes in 400 to 500 hours from a complete kit. From AINonline.com, ForeFlight Labs releases Taxi Routing Editor. ForeFlight has open features for user testing in its ForeFlight Labs, and the first is called Taxi Routing, which lets users chart their course from the ramp to the runway and vice versa. Taxi routing, or routing if you prefer, uses the same bubble editor format as ForeFlight's regular flight planning, but also adds some useful conventions to help plot the course to or from various locations on the airport, including a runway after landing and FBOs pre-departure. At present, the feature doesn't include airline gates or other areas of the airport. A taxi route button in the flight plan editing section opens taxi routing. Instructions give hints for each step, starting with selecting the start location, then the destination. Taxi routing can go from an FBO to the runway, from a runway to another runway, from a runway to an FBO, or from FBO to FBO. Because taxi routing is a ForeFlight Labs feature, the company is asking for user feedback, and a feedback button pops up in email for submitting comments. The latest release of ForeFlight, version 13.3, includes other new features. Dynamic wind speed and temperature layers show animated wind speed and temperature forecast anywhere in the world. Time and altitude sliders allow the user to view forecasts at various altitudes. The layers are both saved for offline viewing, but it only stores the information for the flight planned route. ForeFlight also released a toggleable day-night mode for the airport 3D view, so pilots can see what an airport's runway lighting looks like from any viewing angle. Other new features include drag-and-drop file importing and background downloads, which allows users to use other apps while downloading new data. From AOPA.org, ForeFlight Flyout focuses on airports in the West in May. Fly to certain airports in Arizona, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, and Utah in May to take part in the ForeFlight Flyout. ForeFlight has partnered with AOPA to highlight airports across the country through July to encourage pilots to visit different areas. To participate, pilots who use ForeFlight can download the Regional Location Content Pack for the month of May, look at the custom trip kits for each of the featured airports to plan activities at the destinations, then plan, file, and log your flight through ForeFlight. The track log will automatically enter you in the contest. Stop in at a partnering FBO to pick up free ForeFlight gear and share photos of your trip on social media. ForeFlight is highlighting airports in the West in May, so be sure to visit the participating FBO at these airports. And I'm not going to read the FBOs, but I will tell you the airports that you need to go to. They include Centennial Airport in Colorado, Big Bear City Airport in California, Cedar City Regional Airport in Utah, Sonoma County Airport in Santa Rosa, California, Ogden-Hinckley Airport in Ogden, Utah, Carson City Airport in Carson City, Nevada, Sedona Airport in Arizona, and Honolulu and Kona International Airports in Hawaii. From pilotweb.aero, Netjets orders 20 supersonic jets. In what is demonstrably a firm vote of confidence in the future of supersonic business jets, fractional bizjet operator Netjets has revealed a purchase order for 20 Ariane AS2 supersonic jets. Ariane is currently building a new headquarters in Melbourne, Florida, and plans to start production of the AS2 next year. The company said its order book is now valued at more than $10 billion, each AS2 having a price of $120 million. Ariane and Netjets have also signed an exploratory agreement for Netjets to become the exclusive business jet partner for Ariane Connect, which is described as urban and regional networks to provide a seamless point-to-point experience optimized for speed and luxury across multiple modes of transportation. Ariane has also just released the first glimpse of its next aircraft, the AS3. This would be a commercial airliner capable of attaining Mach 4. The company is planning to make its first flight before the end of the decade. With 760 aircraft, Netjets is the world's largest operator of business jets. From journalstar.com, which I think is a newspaper in Nebraska, worst-case scenario led to plane's 1.5-mile ghost flight and crash near Central City. The small plane that flew away on its own from the Central City airport last week didn't have an ignition switch, and that was the key to its 1.5-mile unmanned flight. And let me jump in and add for a moment here that actually the Piper Cub, which is referenced in the story, does have a mag switch. What it doesn't have is an electrical system or a starter motor, so it has to be hand-propped. Getting back to the story, Merritt County deputies were dispatched at about 7:30 p.m. to a plane that had crashed in a cornfield southwest of the airport, and they found a cloth-winged 1941 Piper Cub on its back, but they didn't find a pilot. They learned a mechanic had been working on the plane when it roared to life, took off, and managed to climb an estimated 200 feet. Here's how that happened, said Denise Zimba, emergency manager for Boone, Nance, and Merritt counties. The mechanic was attempting to start the plane, which requires hand cranking its propeller because it doesn't have an ignition switch. He must not have realized the throttle was wide open, she said. The plane was poised to fly. And when he hand-turned the propeller, the worst-case scenario happened. It's unclear how many human-piloted planes have taken off without pilots on board. The NTSB investigates U.S. aircraft accidents, but its definition for an aircraft accident requires a person to be on board during the incident, according to spokesperson Peter Knudsen. Quote, "There was no person on board the aircraft, so it would not meet the definition of accident for our purposes," he said. "We do investigate accidents involving unmanned aircraft systems, but this was not one of these." And finally, from KearneyHub.com, this is about another Nebraska incident. Grand Island Airport standoff suspect tried to see girl at Kearney High School. Pilot praised. Grand Island Police Captain Dean Elliott praised the work of the pilot who removed a rifle from a private aircraft while the suspect was sleeping in the back of the plane last week at Central Nebraska Regional Airport. The pilot took an AR-15 and a bag from the plane before police were summoned. He deserved kudos because, quote, "he was the only one that actually grabbed what ended up being the only weapon," Elliott said. That was great thinking on his part to do that. 2 hours later, police arrested the suspect, Tyler Caudill of Phillips, which I presume is in Nebraska. When police arrived, they didn't know if Caudell had another weapon with him on the plane. The AR-15 was not loaded, but police did find ammunition on the plane after Caudell was taken away. So if the pilot hadn't removed the rifle, it's possible that bullets could have been fired. Knowing what we now know after the fact, it definitely could have been a lot worse, Elliott said. During the standoff, the tower was evacuated and the airport was shut down. The jet aircraft owned by Menards arrived in Grand Island on Tuesday morning. The aircraft, which seats 8, was scheduled to depart Tuesday night, but as of Wednesday, the plane was at the airport still being checked out. Caudell, 19, tried to gain entry to Kearney High School on Monday. Reportedly, Caudell went to the high school to meet with a female student, said Sergeant Tony Cordova of the Kearney Police Department. Upon learning that Caudell allegedly had taken a family vehicle and rifle from his home, Kearney officials placed the school in lockdown on Tuesday. After Caudell was taken into custody, he admitted to police that his intent was to fly the aircraft. Police observed Caudell sitting in the captain's chair, donning a headset and manipulating switches, which is why the plane was being checked out Wednesday. Caudell was arrested for first-degree criminal trespass, terroristic threats, criminal mischief, attempted theft, resisting arrest, and use of a weapon to commit a felony. And the story doesn't mention the name of the pilot who took the rifle out of the aircraft, but we're certainly all grateful for his actions. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll talk with Dr. Greg Van about what you need to know about hearing loss. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now for some updates. Stick around if you would till the end of the show. We've got a listener question about Rich of Peak Operation, and Mike Bush is here to answer that question. He, of course, is an expert on engines. I've had a pretty busy flying schedule for the last month, and I do want to pass along congratulations to my client, Jeremy Webb, who passed his instrument check ride a few days ago. He and I started his training in a simulator last summer when I wasn't flying due to the pandemic, and we finished it up in a Cirrus SR20 that he rented at the West Valley Flying Club at the Palo Alto Airport here in Northern California. And if you happen to be in Northern California and you're interested in flying a Cirrus, let me know. I've got a little bit of time in my schedule now that he has finished his check ride. Also, I wanted to mention to you that I have made a change in the podcast. I have included chapter markers in this episode and in the prior episode 186. Now, chapters let you skip around a podcast, though not all podcast players support chapters or all of the features of chapters. For example, if you're using the Apple Podcast app right now, you can swipe up on the screen, and at the bottom you'll see all of the chapters listed there, and you can touch on them to jump around. Also, as each story comes up, you'll see an image associated with that story or chapter that I've added. I've also added links to each story and chapter, though the Apple Podcast app doesn't support the links feature. Now, if you're using the Overcast podcast player, it's just the opposite. That player apparently doesn't support the images that I've included, but it does support the links. So play around with that chapters feature and send me your feedback about whether you like chapters, or let me know if you really don't care either way. Because adding the chapters and the images does take a fair amount of time, and I'm not committed to doing it for all future shows, which is why I really value your feedback about chapters or about anything else related to the show. Now, here's an item that came out on generalaviationnews.com a few days ago. Apparently, the final NTSB report came out for an accident that was fatal in May of 2019. A Piper PA-28140 was destroyed when it hit terrain shortly after takeoff from the Foley Municipal Airport, that's 5R4 in Alabama. The flight instructor was seriously injured, and the student pilot was killed in the crash. According to a witness who was a flight paramedic on another instructional flight at the airport, he saw the Piper take off from runway 36 after a touch-and-go landing. He then heard the flight instructor announce on the radio, "My engine just quit." He saw the plane pitch up, quote, like a power-on stall, and then lean to the left to start a spin, about 300 to 400 feet above the ground. He added that it was only about 3 seconds from the time he saw the plane in the nose-high pitch attitude to when it was descending toward the ground. A flight instructor who was entering the traffic pattern at 5R4 reported that the airplane seemed to be making an aggressive left turn as if he were returning to the airport. The probable cause, according to the NTSB, was a partial loss of engine power due to a stuck exhaust valve and the flight instructor's exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack following the loss of power, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall at low altitude. Now, it sounds like this CFI did what the FAA refers to as the impossible turn, which is turning back to the airport after an engine failure at low altitude. But worse than that, he apparently continued to pitch up even after the engine failed. And of course, as you know, when an engine fails, you need to pitch the nose down, in fact, quite a bit down. Otherwise, the aircraft will stall, which can be fatal at low altitude. Now, just in the past week, I've watched people pitch up too much in 2 different cases. And in both cases, I had to intervene by pushing the yoke or side stick forward. In one case, I was working with a longtime client in a Cessna 172. We were practicing an emergency approach to landing, and I had the pilot pull the power when we were at 4,500 feet over a private airport that's around 600 feet MSL, so we were about 4,100 feet above it. The pilot performed very well, except when I had him initiate a go-around, he pitched the aircraft up too high for our configuration, which was with full flaps. In another case, for a pilot who hadn't flown in a long time, we were practicing a go-around, which he was expecting because I told him ahead of time we'd be doing it. Yet when I told him to go around, he pitched up to too high an attitude, and the aircraft was slowing before I intervened. So pilots really need to know the pitch attitudes required for different phases of flight, especially for emergencies and for situations that they don't encounter often, such as go-arounds. Now, if you haven't heard it already, I'd like to suggest you go back and listen to episode 68 called 10 Things to Know About the Impossible Turn After a Takeoff Engine Failure. And number 2 was understanding your lizard brain will take over in an emergency and will tell you to turn back to the runway. Number 10 was always do a pre-takeoff briefing before you take off. And that briefing should include a minimum altitude that you commit that you will reach before you consider turning back to the runway. And if you have an engine failure prior to reaching that altitude, you need to commit to landing more or less straight ahead. And if you do have an engine failure during a climb out, you may have as little as 5 to 6 seconds to lower the nose from a climb attitude all the way down to the best glide attitude before the aircraft stalls. And if you have never simulated that before at a safe altitude, you'll probably be surprised at how far you have to push the yoke or the stick in to get the nose down to where it needs to be, transitioning from a climb attitude down to best glide. So please do a pre-takeoff briefing before every takeoff, and say aloud that if the engine fails below a certain altitude, you will land straight ahead. Now, I had a message from Patreon supporter Jim Goldfuss just a day or so ago. He sent me a message that ties into last week's story about a new private pilot who was buzzing as low as 80 feet over Sag Harbor in Long Island. That plane was based in East Hampton, which is a few miles away, and the town of East Hampton is actively discussing the possible closure of that airport. Now, if the buzzing incident hadn't occurred, they would still be considering airport closure, but that buzzing incident was one of the things cited by residents who called into an East Hampton Town Board work session held earlier this week that I listened to live for over an hour. Now, that airport has a unique problem, which is that it's a very popular vacation destination, especially for people who live in New York City. And while most of those people travel by car, a tiny percentage of those people arrive by helicopter or in one of the Cessna Caravan 208 seaplanes that flies back and forth to the city. The most noise complaints were against Sikorsky S-76 helicopters, and the second most complaints were against the Caravan seaplanes I've mentioned. Now, I listened as at least a dozen residents called in to complain to the town board, and not a single person called in to support the airport while I was listening. While most of the complaints were about noise, there were a number of people who argued that closing the airport would reduce air pollution and benefit climate change. And there is an organized effort to close the airport. One of the callers was from an organization called Say No to KHTO, which has a website that makes a case for closing the airport. Now, apparently the town stopped accepting FAA grant money many years ago, so legally they are allowed to close the airport starting in September of this year. So if you're a pilot on Long Island or even in neighboring Connecticut and you use the East Hampton Airport, you might want to participate in future town board meetings to express your support of the airport. And I wanted to mention a really nice tweet that was sent out on Twitter by Micah. You may have heard him on the Airplane Geeks podcast, which I have my co-host for. He wrote, "Finally convinced my cousin to let me get him Max Truscott's G1000 in Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook. After reading through it, he said it was one of the best gifts he ever received as a pilot, and he finally understands the G1000. Thanks, Max Truscott." And I sent a message to Micah, and he followed up, and he said, referring to the cousin. He kept complaining about it being an analog guy, and he couldn't figure out how to use the G1000. For years, I've been telling him about your book, and I told him I would get it for him. He refused until finally he got regularly stuck in a 182 that has the G1000. He kept complaining about it to me, and I said, would you please let me get you this book? I know it will help you. Anyway, so now you know the results. He's incredibly happy after years of complaining and refusing to fly any plane that had a G1000 in it. Micah, that's a great tweet. Thanks so much for sharing that information. And I'll just mention to anybody who's listening, if you do fly a G1000 or prospective aircraft, there are links in the show notes, and you can find the show notes at aviationnewstalk.com/187. Just click on the link and you can buy any of my books from there. And I hope you enjoyed last week's show, Aviation Stories of the Weird with Rob Mark. When we previously did that some months before, I had found a number of NASA ASRS safety reports that were about strange problems that pilots had had using their iPads in the cockpit. So I went back to see what new iPad reports were in the NASA ASRS for the past year. And I found, interestingly, a cluster of reports that mentioned iPads and TFRs. In fact, there were 6 of them, which I thought was quite a bit for 1 year. I'm going to talk about just 2 of those because they're representative of all these reports. This first one is from a turbojet. So 2-engine jet. He says upon IFR departure, he tried to pick up an IFR clearance from both the flight service frequency and the Dallas-Fort Worth frequency. So this is obviously somewhere down in Texas. Unable to get clearance on the ground. At this time, local tower and approach departure control had closed. I decided to depart VFR and pick up my clearance in the air. It was a clear night with no reported traffic, so I departed VFR off a runway 18, set initial climb altitude to 17,500 feet. At about 10 nautical miles, noticed alert from iPad that TFR was ahead. Ended up clipping the northwest corner. As soon as error was noticed, immediate corrective action was taken to clear the TFR. Time in the TFR estimated at less than 20 seconds. He says, tower approach states, when you're talking with us, you can proceed through the TFR. We are normally talking to ATC and routinely fly through the TFR without thinking about it. Hence, we developed complacency toward the TFR. Tower approach control had just closed. Just before the tower closed, we heard an arriving aircraft ask about the TFR, and tower reported that the area was not in use and allowed the aircraft to fly through the TFR. I was unable to reach flight service or center on the ground to open our flight plan or talk to ATC. Hence, we elected to depart VFR and pick up IFR en route. We had the TFR displayed on moving maps on both iPads. It did not get our attention. He says the factors were complacency mentioned above, fatigue after a long flying day, and it was just a ferry flight home. The TFR should have been displayed graphically on the aircraft's moving map, but the Sirius XM weather subscription recently expired. TFR option was selected for display, but we were not receiving Sirius XM data. We saw another aircraft in the TFR. Didn't occur to us it was a military drone until they called us on the radio. Having never operated there at night, maybe had an assumption they wouldn't be flying when the tower was closed. Synopsis, captain of a corporate jet reported a TFR violation occurred in part because their Sirius XM subscription had expired. And here's another report. This one mentions ForeFlight, but I saw other similar reports for Garmin Pilot as well, so this could happen regardless of what electronic flight plan you're using. This says the make and model was a small aircraft, high-wing, single-engine, fixed-gear aircraft. The reporter says, I had a possible unintentional TFR violation by clipping the corner of a sporting TFR. I assumed the TFR wasn't active due to COVID-19 and was not being over 30,000 people in attendance in the event. I made my flight plans on ForeFlight and didn't see an active TFR in the area. However, I later realized I didn't see the TFR because I didn't have TFRs turned on ForeFlight. Now that's a map layer that you need to turn on if you want to see it. I now have the setting turned on my iPad. I will prevent another occurrence like this by making sure my settings are turned on properly and by being more diligent in my flight planning both on the air and in the ground. And the synopsis, pilot reported a sporting TFR airspace incursion due to not having it selected on the app being used. And by the way, that was kind of the common theme of most of the other reports. People were using an iPad, but they had the TFR layer turned off. They flew into a TFR because it was not being displayed on their iPad. And here's an email I wanted to share from a recent supporter on Patreon. He had just joined us, and so I emailed him back and said, how did you find out about the show? And he wrote, A bit ashamed to admit, but I've been a listener for a while, at least dating to 2018, following shortly after learning about this show from the Airplane Geeks podcast. The shame comes for waiting too long and becoming a supporter. Honestly, I never thought much about it. Anything electronic is free, right? Until I heard your statements connecting the value brought by Aviation News Talk to time spent with an instructor. That resonated and put the show into a different context in my mind, not just educational entertainment that one may find from podcast, but something more akin to fun instruction applicable in the airplane as well as day-to-day life on the ground. Apologize for the long answer, but hopefully such feedback affirms that you are doing great work. Well, thank you so much for sending that along. No need to be ashamed, but thank you for joining, even though you've been listening for a very long time. And let me just go ahead and mention some of the other people who've just recently joined us in the show in the last 2 weeks. We have a new mega supporter, Chris Carnahan. He is the president of Boone Valley Forest Products, and he flies a VTOL Bonanza out of the Spirit Airport in St. Louis. Other new supporters include Joel Newman, edited his pledge up to $15 a month. Raul Casas-Doles edited his pledge up to $20 a month, so he's also getting our bonus videos. Ed Perry edited his pledge up to $8 a month. Luke Clausen edited his up to $10 a month. Jonathan Marty signed up at the $35 level, so he's also getting free access to my courses online at pilotlearning.com. Joseph Schuchart, and now this says that he has pledged €7, so he's in Europe somewhere. Thanks so much, Joseph. Other new supporters are Hunter McDaniel and Aaron. And we had some one-time donations from people who donated through PayPal. One is from Scott Denstedt for $50. John Mahaney, who I remember when I first ran into him at Oshkosh and have gotten to know him over the years since then, donated $25. Thank you, John. And Deidre Powell, who made a $50 donation. Now, signing up for the show couldn't be easier. It'll only probably take you 2, 3, maybe 4 minutes max to do that. 2 ways to donate. If you'd like to donate on a regular monthly basis, go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, enter your credit card, and you can read there about all the various goodies that you'll get. Or you can donate via PayPal, and you can make either a monthly or a one-time donation via PayPal, and you don't even need a PayPal account to do that. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal and enter your credit card information. Coming up next, Dr. Greg Van, and later, Mike Bush on engines, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about hearing loss, which, as you'll hear in the conversation, is a very important topic to me as I have some hearing loss. Dr. Greg Van is a family physician who works at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and specializes in aerospace medicine. He's an AME who gives FAA medical exams, and he's the medical director for their Clear Approach service, which answers medical questions from pilots around the world for a small fee. He's also the host of the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast, which can be found wherever you get your podcast. Now here's our conversation with Dr. Greg Van. Well, Dr. Greg Van, it is great to have you on the show, finally meet you in person. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Max. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show with you. I'm a big fan.
That's awesome. Great to have you here. Well, you and I have talked via email about hearing loss, and certainly that's something that both of us think is a very important topic that's underrated by pilots. Pilots just don't seem to realize how serious an issue this is. Help us understand what hearing loss is like for someone who has lost some of their hearing.
Yeah, I really think you're right on with that. A lot of people, when they think about hearing loss, it's just kind of one of those things they just don't really pay attention to, or they just kind of happen with age and things like that. But it can be quite disturbing for someone's life. And I think a good place to kind of start with that is to just kind of give some examples. Most people think about hearing loss in the setting of some sort of accident or being exposed to a huge sudden noise like an explosion or something like that. But it actually typically, from what we see in medicine, is more insidious and slow. And it only becomes an issue when it's unfortunately too late. One example I could think of is I did have a patient at one point who was involved in printing of newspapers. And he had been doing this for about 30 years of his life. And as you can imagine, back in the old days, things weren't nearly as digital. And so he was exposed to this sort of low-level humming noise on a daily basis, 8 hours a day, just enough to kind of be annoying when you're at work, but not enough to think, is this going to hurt me? And unfortunately, noise-induced hearing loss and those kind of issues is only something that's become forefront in regards to work safety in the last 20 or 30 years. So anyhow, this individual, didn't have any kind of huge exposures, no accidents at work, no injuries to his head, and just constantly exposed to this humming. And slowly but surely, as time went on, he started having more difficulties hearing others and understanding language. As is often very typical with noise-induced hearing loss, we start to lose the frequencies that are higher in frequency. So the higher pitched noises, in other words, so it's not like a rumble from your car or something like that, but often more associated with sounds with conversation, especially from females. And that's not an inside joke or anything like that. But after time, this became so problematic that he wasn't able to communicate effectively at work. He wasn't able to communicate at home as well, and ended up missing out on a lot of things that he used to enjoy quite a bit. And that's when he ended up coming to me for help. And it's a story that I hear very often where they said, well, I just didn't think it was that big of a deal. I wore my hearing protection sometimes over the last 30 years, but over time, those kinds of exposures can really just add up and leave somebody, unfortunately, missing out on a good part of their lives. Now, that is sort of a understandable one, and some people are still not surprised by that, when they think about big machinery, but it's not always so obvious as that either. I had another patient once who was a receptionist, and she basically wore a headset in her ear on one side for, again, about 30 years. And slowly but surely, as we age, you have to start turning things up because we automatically lose some of our hearing as we get older. But she kept turning up her microphone, and eventually it was basically blaring in her ears by the end of her career. And on top of that, outside of work, she was finding that she could also not hear people's conversations well. And again, started having difficulties doing many of the things that she enjoyed in life. And lo and behold, we did testing and found out that she had one-sided noise-induced hearing loss just from wearing this headset for 30 years. And so it's not the most obvious thing for individuals, and that's really the danger when it comes to noise-induced hearing loss.
And I've heard that airline pilots often will have hearing loss in just one ear because many of the headsets that they wear are going into just one ear as well. Now, I have some hearing loss, which I had early on, and I think it was probably mostly from my ham radio. Back as a teenager, I was trying to listen and talk with people in all 50 states on the 80-meter band, which is extremely difficult to accomplish, which I remember trying to pick out signals from Alaska from huge static crashes, and I would go to bed afterwards and my ears would just kind of hurt. And my experience is that I find that in restaurants in particular, I have a really hard time hearing, and my family's learned to kind of put me in the corner so that there's nice solid wall behind me. I get a little bit more reflection of the sound, and it's a little easier to hear. Tell us about other kinds of problems people have. If you have hearing loss, what kinds of things are hard to do?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. A lot of people have troubles picking out certain voices within a conversation in a room, for example, with a group of people. That is often one of the things that can be really troublesome. So you often will see people having to lean forward or turn their ear to the direction that they want to hear. And that can sometimes be difficult. I have to do that myself, unfortunately, because I also have some hearing loss as well. Another thing that tends to come up is that individuals will have problems with certain consonants and sounds. So like S and SH and TH and F. So it's like the cell, fel, and fel all sound about the same when you have hearing loss, which, as you can imagine, can be really, really difficult to deal with. In addition to that, it's important to remember that the problems with hearing loss extend beyond hearing, because it can be quite disturbing to one's life. So we also see a fair amount of mental health complaints, like depression and anxiety. The way I like to explain this to people is that, have you ever been in a car full of people and you're trying to navigate through traffic and everyone is chattering or kids are screaming in the background and you're like, stop it, I need to concentrate here. It can be that kind of situation chronically if you have bad hearing loss. Another thing that can happen is you can have tinnitus, which is ringing in the ear. Well, okay, it was commonly described as ringing in the ears, but actually it can be quite a few different sounds like roaring or staccato sound as well too. And that can be quite disturbing for individuals. Again, it would be kind of similar to that car full of people chattering all the time when you're trying to sleep. And that can be very, very difficult. We've also seen information that hearing loss and tinnitus can cause elevated blood pressure, elevated heart rate, and insomnia as well. So there's a lot of things that can come with this problem.
Well, my blood pressure is going up just now as we talk about this.
Yeah, I can relate.
So tell us about different parts of the population and how hearing loss affects people of different ages.
So this is fairly common. I guess hearing loss in general is fairly common. It does happen as we age, and that's a very specific pattern that we see when we test individuals. But on top of that, we estimate right now about 6 to almost 25% of the population under the age of 70 has some form of noise-induced hearing loss. Rather alarmingly, we also see that almost 6% of teens under the ages of 17, that is, also have some form of hearing loss. And so that may seem surprising, but it's not like we're putting kids to work in factories with loud machineries, but it's the popularity of ear pods and other headphones that kids are using these days, or a lot of people using in general, that has contributed to this. Unfortunately, it's really easy to crank up the volume on those things. So yeah, not an uncommon problem, unfortunately. But again, it's something that a lot of people don't realize it's going on until they either have a formal test or it starts to creep up with symptoms, with conversation, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that young people in particular don't understand. They may think that, I may damage my hearing by going to a loud rock concert somewhere. But if they crank the AirPods up, it's as if they are at a loud rock concert.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the physiology of how hearing loss actually occurs. What's going on inside the ear, and what are we doing to mess that up?
Yeah. So I don't want to lobotomize the listeners here, but so I'll try to keep this as straightforward as possible, because I could probably go on forever on this. But, let's start first with what sound is, and that compared to noise. So sound, as we all know, is basically the compression of air molecules in the air around us. And that propagates as a wave as it goes through the air. So when the noise reaches our head, it actually encounters our ear lobes, otherwise known as auricles, and that's where the sound is magnified as it travels into the inner ear canal there. And that's where you get, your wax, and people are sticking Q-tips in, even though they're not supposed to. And at the back of that canal is the eardrum, which is basically just like a drum. It's a little elastic membrane there. And it goes back and forth, and that's attached to 3 little bones in the middle of the ear that's attached to another drum, and that drum moves some fluid around on the inside of your ear around the nerve that senses hearing. It's that motion, that fluid motion that the airwave gets transmitted into, that is what we call hearing. So that's sound is actually a different definition for noise, which is when sound actually becomes irritating or damaging. And everybody's a little bit different about that. But what we find is that typically occurs around 85 decibels. And decibels are the way you can measure sound. And there's a couple of different scales out there. The one that we typically use is A. So that's why you might see that there's different sounds listed as. So right about 85 decibels, that's when things become irritating and sound goes to noise in general. And that's also where we start to see that people can have damage to their ears once they get above that routinely. And basically it's that wave of air and compression going into the ear and basically pushing so hard on everything that the nerves inside of the ear become damaged and injured. It's kind of like a tsunami after an earthquake. You can imagine that fluid is normally moving around inside of the ear against the nerve pretty smoothly and steadily. But if you have a big crashing tidal wave into the nerve, that's where you can result in permanent damage. And this can be quite severe. Sometimes it's slowly on onset, as we discussed, but there can also be times when the whole ear is exposed to just a huge amount of sound, and then there's instantaneous damage. The bad thing about this situation is that unfortunately there is no coming back from hearing damage. Once the cells of the nerve are damaged, it's permanent.
Mm. And I think people are probably surprised about the common everyday things that can cause some hearing loss. Let me just give you an example. I went and used an app that you can find on your phone. I'll tell people what it is right now. It's NIOSH, NIOSH, SLM, sound level meter. That's it, SLM. And just driving along in the car with the windows closed, I measured 70 dBA. With the windows open on my side, it jumped up to 90 dBA, which is above the threshold for damage. And I know people love having the window open to get the cool breeze. But what I've discovered, and I figured this out years ago, is if I, instead of opening the driver window, just open the passenger window if you're alone in the car by yourself. And now the noise is going to only be 80 dBA. So huge difference by just one little subtle difference like that.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point. Most people think about sound as just the volume, but it also matters how far away you are from the sound source and also how long you're exposed to that source. Again, if it's a really massive sound, a huge explosion that can cause instantaneous damage. So it can be an impulse moment, as we say, but also can be long-term. But adjusting any of those variables can help decrease the possibility of hearing loss.
Well, this also applies for reducing noise in noise-sensitive areas when you're flying. So, for example, I think the volume of noise follows the square law. So essentially, if you're twice as high, the amount of noise reaching the surface is going to be 1/4 as much. So when we're taking off, for example, out of Palo Alto, rather than turning over the houses at 500 feet, I wait to 1,000 feet because I know that the noise will be 75% less by just waiting to climb to 1,000 feet.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does drop off quite quickly. So that's where keeping that distance in mind and making just a small adjustment in some of your plans, I think when flying can help with that noise abatement quite a bit.
Well, and there are other really subtle things. I find that particularly in the older Cirruses, people tend to slam the doors. And let me tell folks, the new ones, you don't need to slam the doors. Please don't do that on the new ones. But I'll try to make sure I've got my headset on before I see the door about to get slammed. Or if I can't do that, I'll just put my hand up really quickly to my ear. And even if I don't have it all the way across my ear, that's going to stop that pressure wave. It's from hitting my ear directly. It's going to hit my hand first. Yeah,
that's a good point. Two things. First of all, for listeners, I as I mentioned in my podcast, I am switching into the Cirrus right now after I got my pilot's license. And so I did my first flight in the SR20 just a few days ago. And one of the things that did strike me was how hard I had to pull the door to get it to slam shut, which I think startled my instructor a little bit too. And I did notice it was quite loud when I did that. So that's a good thing to know, that I maybe don't need to do it that hard in the future. But also I like the idea of, just holding your hand up. It's a small way of protecting yourself and an active process of protecting your hearing. Hearing protection doesn't mean that you have to buy fancy headsets all the time and walk around constantly with earplugs around your neck. But just doing small things like, just covering your ear when something's going to be coming that's loud can make a huge difference.
Well, let's talk about some of the dB from different sources. I used that same sound level meter in the airplane a couple of days ago, and I was in a Cessna 182. And when we first started it at idle, it was at 83 dB, which is virtually at that 85 dBA threshold we were talking about. In the run-up, when we were doing the mag check, it went up to 94 dBA. At takeoff, we were at 100, and then when we throttled back a little bit in cruise, we were at 94 dBA. In the 172 that I flew shortly thereafter, it was only about 5 dB quieter in cruise, or actually during takeoff. So it was 95 dBA versus 100. So these are all pretty high levels. I know folks have talked about helicopters being particularly noisy up to 102, but surprisingly, a 182 is almost as noisy as some helicopters.
Yeah, it seems like from the studies that I've seen out there, the level of noise that we hear inside the aircraft, whether it be a 182 or 172 or even the bigger ones, they all have the ability to cause some hearing damage, meaning they're all right about 85 decibels or above at some point, even early in the flight. Fortunately, though, the headsets that we're all using are able to bring down the decibels at least about 10 to 20 decibels on average. And so just by wearing a headset, and it doesn't have to be one of the fancy ones either, you can afford yourself quite a bit of hearing protection there. And you're going to be underneath that level where noise-induced hearing loss can occur.
So one of the things I'm always concerned about, not just pilots, but people out working on the ramp, people who are fueling aircraft, people who are marshaling in aircraft. A lot of these are young folks, and I don't think they have any idea that they're exposing themselves to all kinds of damage that will be permanent.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I see most of the exposures occur, unfortunately. It seems pretty straightforward. If you're going to get into the cockpit and fly, you're going to wear your headset most of the time, right? But it's when you're walking across the ramp to get in and there's a jet warming up right next to you, or some of those other individuals working at the airport, like the linemen and so forth. Yeah, I rarely see them wearing any kind of hearing protection. It's just one of those things that unfortunately it takes a lot more effort to create that kind of safety culture at work, in the work environment. It's something that many companies struggle with. But I think that if everybody out there that's listening does their part to protect their hearing more actively, it's one of those trends that settles in and more people start following it. And so when I'm walking across the ramp and things are loud, I don't have any problems putting in some earplugs. I've got some of those ones that are connected and they drape around your neck, so it's easy to do that. Just to protect myself in case something happens that makes a loud sudden impulse noise, or just give myself some protection. And it also sets a good example for everybody else.
Well, I will often sometimes, if I see someone who's not wearing ear protection, who's a fueler or something like that, I'll mention it to them. I'll just say, hey, you really ought to be wearing ear protection, and tell them, hey, I have a little bit of hearing loss, and kind of help them understand just how serious it is. And the other thing I've found is sometimes I'll be pre-flighting an aircraft that happens to be located near the run-up area. And holy cow, that can be awfully noisy, standing outside your airplane for 20 minutes, listening to other planes that are close by that are very loud. And I'll sometimes just take my Lightspeed headset and I'll put the cords and the control box in my pocket, and I'll just walk around with the headset turned on the outside. And that really makes it more comfortable for me, and hopefully is helping preserve my hearing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hearing protection, I always say receiving your hearing is never stylish, but that's okay, because being able to hear in a conversation is. So if it means you got to wear your headset when you're walking around on the tarmac, that more power to you. And, I should probably start doing that, at least keep my ears warm out here in Minnesota during the winter. So good point.
Got to protect them. Well, let's talk a little bit about some common noises and how loud they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see here, this is one of the common diagrams that we like to use when it comes to education about hearing loss. And it lists a couple of the sounds that we normally encounter during the day, not as pilots per se, but I do find it interesting that throughout my entire career in medicine, almost 30 years now, they've always listed a jet engine on there as part of the scale. So you can see at the very bottom, most of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, conversation-wise, things like that, it's about 50 decibels. Running a vacuum cleaner is about 70. And I think most of you would agree that, vacuum cleaners can be slightly irritating and quote-unquote loud. And that's kind of a good level to judge that. If you get above that, what a vacuum cleaner would sound, that's when you kind of start to need to think about, is this something that I should protect myself from? Heavy city traffic with honking and rough roads, about 80 to 90 decibels. That also gives you kind of a good understanding of what to look out for. Power tools, if you ever use a high-powered drill or a saw or anything like that, a little bit stronger. And then you get into the really loud things, motorcycles, rock concerts, about 110, ambulance siren, 120 decibels. Then all the way up to a shotgun, which would be one of those impulse sounds, have 160 decibels. I did have a chance to kind of look up a few other factoids about hearing. A space shuttle launch, which I guess, some of the viewers remember those, is about 160 decibels up close. At a 3-mile mark, it's about 120 decibels. A nuclear bomb, and you can believe they've actually have tested this, they set up a decibel meter 250 feet away from ground zero of a nuclear bomb test, and that registered at 210 decibels, which, according to science, would actually be enough to kill a person, let alone the actual bomb itself. So that kind of gives you an idea. Don't stand 250 feet away from a nuclear bomb explosion, because your hearing, amongst other things, will be not preserved, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I have never heard of anything above 160 decibels, so
yes.
That's pretty phenomenal. Yeah, and I guess what you're saying is when something is that loud, it's just the pressure wave that's going to kill you.
Yes, exactly.
Well, good. There's one thing we don't have to worry about, hopefully. Well, tell us a little bit about hearing and how it's tested for FAA medicals and so on.
Yeah. And so for everyone out there, I'm also an aviation medical examiner, and I do first class to third class exams. So I get to see quite a few pilots in my career. And hearing, as you probably all know, is part of the evaluation for pilots. Now, it can be in a couple of different ways, but the way we typically do it is basically the 6-foot conversational voice test. And basically, that is where a pilot will stand 6 feet away from the examiner, and they have to have their back turned towards me. And you can do it with hearing aids or without hearing aids. And basically, I'll say a few words and ask the pilot to repeat that back to me. And usually what I'll do is say something like, squawk 4706, which for some reason is always a squawk code that I get. I don't know why, 4076, excuse me. And they repeat that, or beta, or turn left Charlie. And if the pilot can repeat that back to me, then that's all the hearing test that we really need to do. Interesting story. I once told a pilot, repeat after me, turn left Alpha. And he actually turned left and faced a different direction and said, wait, where's Alpha? So he's thinking quite literally, I think, stuck in the the taxiing diagram there. But anyhow, so that's one way we can do it. The other way, of course, is we can put someone into a sound booth. And this is just like you remember it back in middle school, where they put the headphones on you, close the door, and they have you push a button when you hear the tones. And there are certain guidelines about how poorly you can do on this. There's also guidelines from the FAA about the good ear versus the bad ear. So your bad ear can't be too bad, and your good ear has to be good enough. If both of those you're unable to pass, the next thing what we'll do is basically a conversation discrimination or speech discrimination test, where we basically have you listen to a few things, and you have to score 70% or above in order to be able to qualify for your medical certificate. So that's, the normal thing. There's 3 ways to do this, right? But let's say you can't pass any of those without using hearing aids. Well, you can use your hearing aids for the test. And as long as you have them there and they're working and you test fine with that, you can walk out with a medical certificate. And we just have to put on your certificate that you do need to be wearing your hearing aids while flying, which is a different topic that we can talk about here in a little bit. But there are pilots out there who are legally deaf, and those individuals can also fly as well. That's where you have to get involved with having what used to be called the SOTA and having a medical flight test. Of course, you'll have the stipulation that you can only fly in areas where radio is not required for pilot activities. So some stipulations, but I think the most important thing for people to realize when it comes to this test is that if you know you have hearing problems, it's better to address those kinds of things before your examination. Because if you come to the exam and you can't pass any of the hearing tests because you don't have a hearing aid available, then you can't get a certificate until something else is done. So I always recommend to pilots that if you think something is coming up, go ahead and visit with your local ear doctor or an audiologist, get tested. And if you have to use hearing aids, so be it, but at least you'll be using hearing aids while you're flying.
And I know very little about hearing aids. What kind of things can you tell us that pilots might be interested in knowing about hearing aids?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of good technologies out there. And I think we've all seen different ones out in public. There's the ones that can go behind the ear. There's now bone conducting ones as well. And there's also ones that can go in the ear. Like any headset in aviation, the key thing is going to be fit and comfort. So the behind the ear hearing aids, they can be somewhat difficult with the earmuffs that we all typically use. The in-ear ones tend to be the most preferred. And the problem is that most of these hearing aids work well with the common headsets out there. Unfortunately, there can be some instances, especially with some of the older headset versions, where you can get some pretty significant feedback and a quite amazingly loud squelching feedback loop going on, which ironically may cause hearing loss in itself, unfortunately. But it's getting better. That difficulty is disappearing. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that's sort of stuck in pilots' minds at this point, that this could happen, and so they are really resistant to using hearing aids while flying and using a headset. But if anyone has experienced that and that's been a barrier to them getting treated and getting a hearing aid, I would say it's time to reinvestigate that and give it a test.
Good. Well, Greg, as we start to wrap up here, any final thoughts you have about hearing loss that pilots and people in aviation should be thinking about?
One thing that always strikes me interesting about pilots is, we can make sure that we have the proper oil in our airplanes for 30 years straight and never miss a preventive maintenance check or anything like that. But when it comes to doing things that are protecting the most critical component of the airplane, which I think is the pilot, it's often difficult for us to remember that those kinds of things. And so when it comes to your hearing, you need to have the same philosophy that you have for your aircraft and your safety as you do for your ears. Prevention and being on top of things early on can go a long ways in making your life a lot more comfortable and making your flying that much longer.
I've always thought that the weak link in flying is usually the nut behind the wheel. So yes, we do have to really take care of ourselves in all regards, and hearing is just one of those. Tell us where people can find out more about you and about the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast.
Yeah. So I am an examiner at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And we have a long history of aerospace medicine there. And myself and my fellow aviation medical examiners see a wide variety of patients from across the world, actually. Some of the most complicated cases involving pilots and their health come to Mayo for evaluation and treatment. And you can go onto our website at mayoclinic.org and search for aerospace medicine, and our division will come up there. And so I'm also the host and medical director for our Clear Approach service. And that's a teleconsulting service where if a pilot has any kind of medical concern or question, they can send me a message using our online service. And usually we'll get back to you in the next 24 to 48 hours. And as part of that service, we also do an educational podcast of the same name, Mayo Clinic Clear Approach Podcast. And you can find that on Spotify, Apple, as well as our website at Mayo Clinic, clearapproach.blueberry.net. And you can feel free to leave comments there. And we always love to hear from pilots and share some of their stories and share some information to keep you all safe.
And you do a great job with the podcast. I've been listening to it since almost the beginning, and I certainly recommend it to anyone who's interested in medicine for pilots. Hey, Greg, thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate all your help here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to next time.
And my thanks to Dr. Greg Van for joining us here today. He's making a lot of great contributions, particularly with their Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast, which you can find wherever you get podcasts. And if you're a pilot anywhere in the world and you'd like to get a medical question answered for a small fee, you can check out the Mayo Clinic's Clear Approach service, and I'll include a link to that in our show notes. And now let's go to this listener question.
Hi, Max. This is Sam Kramer. I discovered your Aviation News Talk podcast about a year ago and have been listening ever since. I am catching up on old episodes, and just today I listened to episode 64 where you spoke with Mike Bush, and I've heard him on your podcast more recently than that and really enjoyed his points of view. But in episode 64, at about the 53-minute point, he says that we now know that leaning your mixture to 50% rich of peak is the worst thing you can do for a piston engine. And I'd really like to hear more information on that, more than just from his point of view. I'm going to be getting a brand new 182 Skylane, and I'm sure my POH is going to say that. The information manual I have in front of me does indeed say, for normal operations, lean to 50% rich of peak. So I'd like to hear more information on why Mike says everyone knows that's the worst thing you can do for a piston engine. Thanks.
Sam, thanks so much for your question. And who better to answer your question than Mike Bush?
Sam, I appreciate your question. I doubt that I ever made the statement that everyone knows that 50 degrees rich of peak is the worst for your engine. I probably said something like, we now know that that's the case.
Well, let's figure this out once and for all, because it just seems like yesterday when Mike was talking.
It turns out that that's not the best way to operate the engines. Most of our airplanes have POHs that recommend cruising at 50 degrees rich of peak. And we now know that that's like the absolute worst mixture you could pick from the standpoint of stress on the engine and longevity of cylinders and so on. That was not information that was available back in the days when most of our POHs were originally written. but these old wives' tales persist. And of course, it's not 50% rich of peak; it's 50 degrees rich of peak. It refers to enriching the EGT from peak EGT so that it drops 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a mixture setting that is recommended in a lot of pilot operating handbooks, particularly for legacy aircraft, because they were written back in the days that we really didn't know any better. But what we know now about what's going on in these engines, a lot of it is due to the very excellent research that my friend George Brawley at General Aviation's Modifications, Inc. did some years ago. He built a very, very elaborate and well-instrumented engine test stand down in Ada, Oklahoma. And he's able to fit engines with special tricked-out spark plugs that have pressure gauges mounted in them, which are all hooked to a computer so that he's able to monitor the actual instantaneous combustion chamber pressure in each cylinder of an engine while it's being run on the test stand. The peak combustion chamber pressure is what the reciprocating parts of the engine feel, if you will. It's the amount of stress that they're placed under at the peak pressure point of the combustion event. And what George was able to determine was that the peak pressure curve, as you vary the mixture, varies in lockstep with the cylinder head temperature curve. So although in our actual airplanes we don't have these tricked out spark plugs and we don't have any way of measuring instantaneous cylinder pressure, we do have cylinder head temperature information. And the point of peak cylinder pressure occurs at roughly the same mixture as maximum cylinder head temperature. And we know from both flight testing and the information that's published by Continental and Lycoming that peak cylinder head temperature occurs at about 40 or 50 degrees on the rich side of peak, which tells us that that's the point of maximum stress on the engine. So as you richen from that point or lean from that point, the stress on the engine is less. That point of 40 or 50 degrees rich of peak is the point where the reciprocating components are under maximum stress. Now, to reduce that stress, you either have to enrichen a lot or you have to lean a little, because as you enrichen, the pressure curve is pretty flat. It doesn't drop off very fast, and so you have to go quite rich in order to make a significant decrease in cylinder pressure. But when you go on the lean side of peak, the pressure drops off very rapidly. The curve drops very rapidly. This is kind of easier to see than it is to talk about. So you only have to go a little bit on the lean side in order to reduce that cylinder pressure a lot. And that's reflected in cylinder head temperatures. You know that you've accomplished it when you see cylinder head temperatures go down. So that's one of the reasons that I prefer operating these engines lean of peak if possible, or if that's not possible, leaned very aggressively near peak. You're mentioning a Cessna 182, and I don't know whether it's a legacy 182 powered by a carbureted Continental engine or whether you're talking about a new 182 that's powered by a Lycoming injected engine. The Continental 0470 engines that were in the legacy Skylanes are among the most difficult engines to lean because their mixture distribution is so miserable. But if you lean an 0470 to the point of engine roughness and then you richen it back just a little bit to make the roughness go away, typically you're in a mode where the front cylinders are running a little rich a peak, the middle cylinders are running about peak EGT, and the rear cylinders are running lean a peak. You can improve that a little bit by adding some carb heat and so on, but that's the typical pattern in those engines, that the front cylinders run rich and the rear cylinders run lean. And so it's a hard engine to operate lean a peak for that reason. Injected engines that have a better mixture distribution work a lot better when you're leaning in the lean a peak area. But in any case, I hope that addresses your question about why I said that 50 degrees rich a peak is the worst place to run your engine. It's certainly the most high stress place to run the engine.
And my thanks to Mike Bush for providing the answer, and to Sam Kramer for sending the question. If you have a question you'd like to send in, you can do what Sam did, and you can look for the Voice Memos app on your phone. Go ahead and record a question of no more than about 90 seconds, and then email it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. Or just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question, and you'll find the SpeakPipe app, which lets you record up to 90 seconds there. And as we come up on the end of the show, just a quick reminder, please take a moment right now and use the share button on whatever app that you're using, and share this episode with any of your aviation friends. And then afterwards, encourage them to either follow or subscribe, depending upon the app. Because if you're enjoying the show, well, heck, your friend probably will enjoy it as well. And this is one of the few ways that we have to grow the show. So thanks so much for sharing it with your friends. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.